Good day. Last 24 hours on the Ukrainian battlefields have been, again, reasonably stable in the sense that one doesn't see any dramatic movements of forces one way or the other. However, they do reinforce a feeling I've been having for some time, since in fact before the events in Kherson region, that in most places the Ukrainians are gradually losing the initiative. In Vuhledar, this southern Donetsk town, which has been the topic of most of the intense fighting recently, and where the Russians recently, after a very hard-fought battle, managed to capture the village, suburb of Vuhledar, if you like, of Pavlovka. There were reports yesterday that the Russians have now gained control on one of the important roads around Vuhledar. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I'm absolutely sure which road it is, whether it is the road from Vuhledar to Marinka near Donetsk. I'm not sure. But whichever road it is, it does reinforce the sense that gradually, ever so gradually, but incrementally and steadily, the Russians are slowly enveloping Vuhledar, which is not, to say it again, a particularly big place, though it is a heavily fortified one. The Russian plan in Vuhledar, as in so many other places, is not to launch an outright frontal attack on the place, but gradually to cut it off from communications, either trapping the Ukrainian defenders within Vuhledar or forcing their retreat. And of course, Vuhledar is important, as I've said previously, because of its location as a hub in the communications network between the Ukrainian forces in Zaporozhye and the Ukrainian troops trying to hold the line, the defenses around Donetsk. And in fact, there's been quite a lot of information trickling out from Donetsk, from the area around Donetsk. It's not entirely easy to fathom it all, to work it all out, but it does seem as if the Russians are steadily making progress, that they've been capturing more places along the Donetsk ring road, that they're gradually breaking Ukrainian defenses there, and that they're moving closer, ever closer to that point where they've surrounded the Ukrainians in Avdiivka, the major Ukrainian concentration near Donetsk city. Fighting is still very intense in that area. I get the sense that it's the usual pattern. The Russians gradually gain control of the odd village or settlement, or sometimes even it's a farm or a major fortified Ukrainian position. The Ukrainians defend these positions to an extreme degree. They often send hundreds, thousands of troops sometimes to try to recapture these positions once they've been lost. The Russian forces repel these attacks. The Ukrainians suffer heavy losses. Then after the Russians have consolidated, which can sometimes take a week or two in these locations, gradually then they are able to resume the advance ever so slowly, ever so systematically, ever so incrementally, as they gradually break Ukrainian resistance around Avdiivka, around Donetsk city, and close ever closer towards Avdiivka. And this seems to be the approach the Russians are taking pretty much in every part of the front line in Donetsk. They're doing this in Vuhledar, they're doing this around Donetsk city, they're doing this near Bakhmut, where again there have been more reports, not always easy to get a complete sense of, but I do get the sense that there's street fighting now consistently happening in Bakhmut, even as the Russians gradually strengthened their grip on the suburbs of Bakhmut. And of course, it's also been happening further north in northern Donbass. And an official of the Lugansk People's Republic now said that the Ukrainian attacks in northern Donbass, the area which the Ukrainians were trying to capitalize on their success in Kharkiv region, that these Ukrainian attacks are now losing force and intensity. And in fact, there was a report again yesterday that another important settlement in this area has fallen back under Russian control. So that seems to be the pattern. And of course, the other aspect of this fighting in this part of the front line is that from a Russian point of view, it helps with their calculus, which is to inflict as heavy losses on the Ukrainians as they possibly can. Supposedly 5-1 losses, 7-1 in some places, 10-1 in others, but whatever, Ukrainian losses in every part of the front line seem to be very high. And by the way, there was another report just yesterday that a Ukrainian military unit mutinied. It again refused to obey orders from the Ukrainian command to launch an attack in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian soldiers there were not prepared to go to certain death. And again, there was disciplinary action had to be taken by the Ukrainian authorities to restore discipline. And on the question of Kherson region, there's been some rather complicated news. Now, this is very difficult to get an absolutely clear picture about, but the Russians are saying that there's no energy, no water, no electricity in Kherson. The city is largely empty and closed down. There's very few Western journalists have been there, and from what I can see, they too seem to show a barely functioning place. And the Russians are saying that there's no attempt by Ukraine to resume economic activity in Kherson region, or I should say more accurately, Kherson region west of the Dnieper. The entire objective seems to be to establish fortified positions there, such as might imply concerns that there might be a Russian counterattack at some point, and also to use this area as a kind of buffer zone between Ukrainian positions in Nikolaev and Odessa and the heavy Russian concentrations on the East Bank in the 60% of Kherson region, which remains under Russian control. Well, that is the overall news from the battle lines. As I said, it's not always easy to get a clear picture of all the things that are happening, but one gets the sense that it's still that attrition war that the Russians are gradually waging, and that as far as they're concerned, this is what General Surovikin said he wanted to achieve, and that it seems to be working increasingly. Well, it's following the course that he has set, and which Putin himself, according to Surovikin, has also set. So that's where we are on the battle lines. Now, the cumulative effect of all those Russian missile and drone strikes on the Ukrainian energy system is that we're now getting official reports, not just from Ukraine, but from the European Union, that the Ukrainian energy system is now at crisis point, that 40 to 50% of it is now being degraded, that many more strikes of the kind that the Russians have been launching, if they continue at this level of intensity, then before very long, the entire energy system will simply break down. It will no longer be possible for Ukraine to be able to generate enough electricity to keep its power system working. And that's going to have, of course, massive effects on the functioning of the Ukrainian economy, the functioning of the Ukrainian railway system, and of course, it's going to have a severe humanitarian impact as well, which is something we must not ever overlook. Now, all of this is the situation on the battlefronts. And what happened to all those diplomatic initiatives we were hearing about so much about just a few days ago? What happened following the meeting between Narishkin and William Burns, the CIA chief, the two intelligence chiefs in Ankara? What happened following the meetings between the telephone conversations between Patrushev and Sullivan, the two national security advisors? There's a lot of talk, lots of rumors, lots of speculation about possible diplomatic initiatives. Well, various Russian officials have been speaking about this over the last couple of hours. We've had comments from Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman. We've had comments from the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. And we've also had comments from Sergei Ryabkov, who is the Russian deputy foreign minister. And all of them have basically said the same thing. They said that they see no sign that Ukraine is interested in negotiations. They see no sign that the United States has any real objectives, any real proposals to make in terms of negotiations. And the Russians have also said, or at least Peskov has said, that the Russian military campaign in Ukraine is not affected by the winter, and it will continue through the winter. There is no conceivable situation that calls for any kind of halt, ceasefire, suspension of hostilities, or anything of that nature. Now, there's also been now this telephone conversation between President Putin of Russia and President Erdogan of Turkey. Now, this conversation was supposed to be intended to facilitate the restart of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Erdogan has been positioning himself many times over the course of this conflict as a potential mediator. Well, the Russians have now provided a relatively short readout of the telephone conversation, and I will read it. And it reads as follows. The leaders conducted a detailed discussion of topical aspects of bilateral cooperation in various spheres. They noted the positive development of trade and economic ties and the steady implementation of important joint projects, including those in the nuclear power industry. They focused on prospects for implementing the initiative to create a major gas hub in Turkey. The president of Russia voiced this initiative in October, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan supported it. The Istanbul Agreements of July 22, 2022 on exporting grain from Black Sea ports and eliminating obstacles to the export of Russian agricultural produce and fertilizer have been extended for another 120 days. I'll come to that in a moment. In this connection, Vladimir Putin and Recep Tayyip Erdogan emphasized the importance of implementing this package agreement comprehensively and completely. Vladimir Putin once again offered sincere condolences in connection with the tragic aftermath of the recent terrorist attack in Istanbul. The presidents agreed to continue their regular multi-level contacts. Absolutely nothing here about negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and between and of Turkey brokering or mediating to set up such communications. As a matter of fact, it seems that Putin and Erdogan have spoken not once but twice, and the Russians appear to have withheld a readout from one of these calls. So it's possible that some discussion about negotiations has taken place, but from the sound of it, the Russians don't seem to be at all interested or particularly keen. Now, I would say that all of this is much as anticipated, much as predicted. And I'm going to say something else. I think that the Russians have been following very closely this incident, this episode, with the Ukrainian missile that landed in Poland. And I think that they're assessing it as a sign that there are the first clear symptoms now in the West of Ukraine fatigue. Certainly, that appears to be what the Chinese are thinking. There's been a long commentary about this incident in Global Times, the Chinese newspaper, which is an unofficial mouthpiece of the Chinese government, and it's quite interesting in offering this article, offering its assessment of this particular episode. And the article says things like the following: the explosion that killed 2 people on Polish territory appears to have been caused by a Ukrainian air defense missile, said leaders of Poland and NATO on Wednesday. Fierce discussions on the incident have revealed an increasingly divided West as fatigue grows over prolonged conflict with no peace talks in sight. And the article then goes on to say that the kind of rhetoric that Zelensky is using is beginning to exhaust the patience of some Western diplomats, reported the BBC on Wednesday. This is Global Times reporting what the BBC has been saying. And Global Times says that the shift in tone is also evident in a CNN report, which accused Zelensky of appearing intent on capitalizing on the episode. They fear that Kiev's at times maximalist language and demands risks adding to so-called Ukraine fatigue among allies, said the BBC. And Global Times goes on to say experts noted a sharp contrast in tone that the US and major European countries are holding towards Russia compared with the past, as they have now taken the initiative to dispel rumors for Moscow rather than blame it in disregard of the facts. By the way, the last, I strongly suspect, is a not so hidden swipe from Global Times at the outcome of the Hague trial of the MH17 affair. It ended, as everybody expected, with a decision condemning 3 officials of the former Donetsk People's Republic, including Igor Strelkov, as responsible for the downing of MH17. And of course, Russia did not participate in the trial, nor did these 3 defendants. And Global Times, through its comment, I think is making it fairly clear that it shares the fairly widespread cynicism that there is around the world about this particular trial. Anyway, returning to the question of the Polish missile, of the Ukrainian missile that landed on Poland, Global Times then quotes Cui Heng, an assistant research fellow from the Center for Russian Studies of East China Normal University, as saying the US-led West does not want to further fan the fire to an extent that they have to engage militarily with Russia. They do not want to become more embroiled in the conflict. However, Ukraine's insistence on refusing to talk has drained the West's patience. Now they find themselves kidnapped by so-called politically correct decisions, Cui noted. In contrast, and then Cui talks about how the Baltic states are still all in for confrontation with the Russians, but then the Global Times article continues to quote Cui as saying the rift between old and new Europe is being magnified. Baltic states and Eastern Europe have been jumping the highest in their anti-Russian stance. For them, it is not only a gesture of their return to the West, a manifestation of their loyalty to Europe, but also a demand for unifying ideology at home. In general, the accident has tested the bottom line of NATO, that it will not have direct confrontation with Russia, and this has ruled out risks of further fueling the conflict, experts said. So notice that it refers to several experts, more than one expert, but in fact the article only quotes one, this gentleman, Mr. Cui Heng, the Assistant Research Fellow for the Center of Russian Studies at East China Normal University. So there we go. The Chinese appear to think that this affair demonstrates Ukraine fatigue in the West, and I think that the Russians are gradually coming round to the same view. I think that they're sensing that they are, if you like, waiting out the West, that they've exhausted the West. The West and Ukraine responded to the Russian military operation in Ukraine's case by massive mobilizations, but these appear to have run their course, and the West responded by a rush of weapons to Ukraine. But as Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has been regularly pointing out, the ability of the Western powers to go on arming Ukraine is also now starting to diminish. And the Russians are noticing this. There have been articles to this effect starting to appear in parts of the Western media, particularly, by the way, the American media, that the ability to go on providing weapons to Ukraine to sustain its war effort is beginning to run down. And of course, the Ukraine is increasingly looking like a heavy liability, a liability which the West doesn't really know what to do with. They can't simply drop Ukraine, even though the simple financial cost of keeping Ukraine running is becoming enormous. And of course, if there's a mass migrant flow from Ukraine, that's going to be politically difficult as well. So they can't just drop Ukraine, but at the same time, they must be starting to worry. They probably are worrying a great deal, in fact, that very soon, as Russian build-up continues, as Russian forces grow in military power, as the reservists are inducted into the Russian army, as the Russian military gets stronger, that the whole situation is going to change in Ukraine, and this whole massive investment in terms of the economic war, the war of economic attrition that has been waged so relentlessly through all of these multiple sanctions, all that investment in weapon systems, all that enormous financial investment in Ukraine, that is all going to be for nothing. And I suspect that at some point there'll be more and more whispers to this effect circulating within Western governments. I get the sense this is already the case in the United States, and I can say definitely that it is the case in Britain. It's not publicly spoken about in Britain, but increasingly I'm getting the sense that in Britain, in fact I know for a fact that in Britain there are people in Whitehall, in other places, who are beginning to say, well, this has gone much too far. We've not achieved the collapse, the implosion of the Russian economy. The Russians are pulling together in Ukraine. They're getting probably stronger there. This has gone as far as it can go, and we've got to start thinking of a way out. Certainly, I get the sense that in Britain, the new Sunak-Hunt government seems less enthusiastic about Ukraine than, say, Boris Johnson's government and Liz Truss's government were. Anyway, that's an impression. I can't be certain about this. I can't be certain about what the West's reaction would be. But I also sense that this is a gradually increasing view in Russia, that they've weathered the storm of Western sanctions. They've weathered the storm of Western arms supplies and of Ukraine's mobilizations. They weathered the storm of Ukraine's counteroffensives. They've kept their forces in Ukraine intact. They're reinforcing. They're getting stronger. And at some point over the next few weeks, months, probably sometime towards the end of December, start of January, they'll be able to move forward towards the attack. Now, whether the Russians have a clearly defined end game, that is something that I simply can't say. Whether they are intending to march on Kiev, whether they expect that they can overthrow the government of Zelensky, replace it with a different government, come to some kind of deal with the United States, whether they foresee a kind of North Vietnam scenario, or South Vietnam scenario rather, in which, as I said, they take over the whole country, whether they come to some kind of partition arrangement with the Hungarians and the Poles. All of that I don't know. Given what a structured government the Moscow government tends to be, I personally would be very surprised indeed if some discussions along these lines have not been taking place in Moscow, that the Russians have not been thinking about end games. But what those discussions are about that, I can't really comment. I'm not obviously in any position to say. What I will say is this. Today, as it happens, the Russian Security Council, the highest policy-making body in Russia, had a meeting. And it's very, very curious seeing the readout that we've been provided about this meeting by the Russian presidential website, the Kremlin's website, because it says that the participants discussed improving civil defense. Well, no doubt they did discuss civil defense, but let's just look at some of the people who attended this meeting. Putin, of course, was there. He attended this meeting. So did Dmitry Medvedev, who is the deputy chair of the Security Council. He's been very active, touring factories, trolling the West, trolling the Ukrainians. He was at one point suggesting that Russia should provide an air defense system to Poland to protect it from Ukrainian missile attacks. As I said, very typical of Medvedev at the present time. But anyway, he was there. Patrushev was also there. He's just returned from his trip to Tehran. He's had his conversations with Sullivan. The Interior Minister, Vladimir Kolokoltsev, the man in overall charge of Russia's police. He was also there. Now, it's interesting because Kolokoltsev has recently visited the Donetsk region, the Donbass region. He's actually had meetings there with various people, obviously discussing internal security issues. Lavrov was also there. Lavrov, of course, has also recently attended the G20 summit. And of course, others were there. Shoigu was there. Bortnikov, the Federal Security Service chief, the FSB chief, was there. Narishkin was there. Narishkin, who's just had this meeting with William Burns, the CIA director, in Ankara. Now, are we really expected to believe that all of these important people who've been so busy on Ukrainian connected things have all met in one venue under Putin's chairmanship, and they haven't talked about all of these topics that I've discussed? Well, of course, the answer is that they have, of course, talked about them. Medvedev will have provided an update about the state of the Russian military industries, which he seems to be over supervising at the moment. The pace of Russian arms production. Patrushev will be talking about will have just talked about his discussions with Sullivan and with Burns. Kolokoltsev will have given a report about what happened during his trip in the Donbass and what he found there. Lavrov will have talked about his exchanges with various people at the G20. Narishkin will have talked about his meetings with Burns in Ankara. So all of these people will have provided reports. Putin will, of course, have listened to them. And I've no doubt that there would have been what the Russians like to call a full and comprehensive discussion of all matters related to the situation, the conflict situation in Ukraine. And as I said, I find it very difficult to believe that this very structured government with all this huge apparatus of think tanks and experts isn't working hard on looking at possible end games. And they will have also heard reports on other matters, because the Russians have also announced that there's been another successful test, perhaps the final test, of the giant Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, which is going to be one of the key parts, component parts of the Russian strategic triad. And they've also installed more. They've also decided to install more avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicles on more Russian ICBMs. So there will certainly have been a discussion about that. There will undoubtedly have been discussions about many other things too. But I can't believe, as I said, that the discussion was only about civil defense, and it's quite likely that Putin in particular will have also wanted to brief everybody about his conversations with Erdogan, and the various Russian officials will have compared notes, discussed where things are, and agreed a way forward. But as I said, overall, I get the sense that, as I said, the Russians feel that, as I said, they've weathered the storm, that they've seen out, they've outstayed, if you like, the West. They've let the West throw everything it can at them in terms of sanctions, in terms of arms to Ukraine. It's now their military industries that are building. There's been reports, by the way, that they're reinforcing their air force. There's a new batch of Sukhoi 34 bombers, apparently, which have now entering service with the Russian Air Force. So the Russian Air Force is being strengthened, and of course Medvedev has been busy, as I said, cranking up the production of weapon systems from the Russian military industries. So, what other things might they have been talking about at this Security Council session? Well, in about a few weeks' time, EU sanctions on Russian oil are due to enter into effect. The Russian economy seems to have absorbed that problem. There's actually been another report recently which has confirmed that after a slight dip in September, Russian industrial production grew again in October. So the output of the economy is rising. Putin had a meeting with one of his industry chiefs and was informed about the fact that the car industry, which has been particularly affected by the sanctions because the car industry in Russia was heavily reliant upon imported components, but that motor vehicle production, car production, including passenger car production, is now once again rising, and that the factories seem to be once more able to resume production, not just resume production, but increase production, suggesting that the problems with subcomponents have, if not been fully cured, at least steps towards curing them have been taken. Something which begs many questions, by the way, about how it's been done, but clearly it does seem as if it is being done. So they'll have talked about the state of the economy. My own feeling is, as I said, that these people who meet in the Russian Security Council must be looking at the situation overall, and they must be feeling that, from their point of view, things are beginning to go their way. There's also been some more news on the, if you like, trading front, which they probably also took into account. There's been the opening of a major railway bridge across the Amur River, linking China and Russia. There's been apparently more steps taken to enhance trade between China and Russia in national currencies, in RMB and rubles. The ruble, by the way, has been pretty steady over the last week, which is another important sign that the economy, the Russian economy overall, is in stable recovery. And they will also have got more reports that Indian oil companies have been placing more orders for Russian oil. The problems of the EU restrictions don't seem to be deterring the Indians at all. So, as I said, I get the sense that we're still very much, as I've said previously, in what Colonel McGregor called the quiet before the storm period, the period when the Russians are gathering their forces, preparing their next big moves, as I said, probably at the end of December, early January. But we're in a relatively quiet period, and the Russians will have noted that, Ukrainian attacks seem to be are continuing to lose momentum. And they will also have noted this strange, complex situation in the West. On the one hand, Americans talk about the need for negotiations, but turn up to meetings, as they did apparently in Ankara, empty-handed, no real proposals offered. Same happens in the telephone calls between Patrushev and Sullivan, whilst at the same time making it increasingly clear that they're becoming increasingly fed up with Zelensky and Ukraine and with what they see as Zelensky's maximalist positions. Now, as I've said many times, the Kremlin keeps its secrets. It doesn't share its plans with people like me. I can only try to the best of my ability to look at what the Russian government, which is extraordinarily successful, effective in preventing rumors and stories circulate about what it's thinking. I mean, just contrast this with how you're constantly reading in the United States, for example, about every argument and quarrel and discussion that is taking place within the US government. With the Kremlin, it isn't like that. It may not be quite as secretive a place as it was in Soviet times, but it's still pretty secretive. It's pretty disciplined. So it's difficult to read exactly what is going on, what the thinking in the Kremlin is. But my own overall sense, as I've said, is that I think that they've been shaping the ground. They must be feeling that their various diplomatic initiatives with China, with India, at the G20, with Turkey, with Erdogan, with Saudi Arabia, that they've all worked out pretty well. They must be feeling that the military balance in Ukraine has now started to tilt again in their favor. And they must also be looking at the situation in Europe and in the United States. And they must be saying to themselves, people there are getting tired of this war. They don't have a clear exit strategy there. They don't know what to do in Washington. They don't know what to do in Brussels. They don't have any kind of path towards achieving any realizable or realistic objectives, whereas we can move forward methodically, incrementally, with our plans and bring them to fruition, and with our next move probably coming fairly soon. Well, that's my assessment of the overall picture up to this point. And as I said, we'll see what the Russians do, but it seems to me that the initiative now is once more with them. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Just to reiterate that you can find us on our various other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and of course Rockfin. And remember that you can catch up with me every Wednesday at 1900 hours Eastern Standard Time on Locals, where I do exclusively my live stream on Locals. And of course you can also if you want to support our work, do so via Patreon and Subscribestar. You'll find links under this video. You can also go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all of those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.